Well, Matt, we got some chance to look at Jed Hoyer's vision, I guess you could say, although it's almost difficult to read with what happened at the trade deadline. Moves Christopher Morel for Isak Paredes. Nate Pearson, a right-hander, comes in, moves Mark Leiter Jr. But, besides the move at third base, not a lot done by Jed Hoyer. Did it clarify his vision at all to you of what direction the Cubs are heading?
Yeah, it did actually. And I think it's interesting how it sort of was a very clarifying moment for me in the same way that I thought the 2017 trade deadline was very clarifying. And that's actually the deadline where they traded Isak Paredes away.
Hmm.
So there's a little bit of history rhyming with itself there. Um, to me, what it says is he still thinks the window is open for this team. Now, not exactly this team. There's more that he understands they have to do. They were trying to do more sort of big things going into the deadline. But I think he generally thinks this is most of a core of a winner. And he recognized that the Morel experiment at third base was not working, that it was likely he'd have to move one of, maybe both of in some ways, Cody Bellinger and Seiya Suzuki to DH. Needed to move on from that, and so make the upgrade to Paredes because you can play him every day at third. But he didn't want to dislodge anything that is going to be important to the window of the 2025 to 2027 Cubs. The same way those 2017 Cubs were trying to trade and maximize a window that didn't really come to fruition for them, but that's what they were angling for at that point, was keep that window on the other side of the championship open and make it another few years of really, really, really good, rather than just taking as many bites at the apple as you can forever. I think he is trying to maximize the 2025 Cubs now. Now, that might mean something different to him than it does to other people. I don't think it means that they go sign Juan Soto, maybe not even necessarily pursue a Corbin Burns this winter. But I think even, the Pearson in, the Mark Leiter out, those moves were almost just perfectly balancing out around what he thought of as the centerpiece of his deadline approach, which was Christopher Morel for Isak Paredes, set up next year where they can run back some of these pieces, but they're going to have to add at least one or two more sort of centerpieces before next opening day.
I was going to say let's explore that a little bit. So he believes that he has the core of a team that can be a winner. I guess I would say you're going to have to expand that core by spending money, right? And Jed Hoyer, he's not frugal at the eighth highest payroll in all of Major League Baseball, but again, he's 4 games under 500 at this moment in time. He is in last place of his own division. So to get where he's going, there are, I hesitate to say core pieces because we can look at some question marks of what happens with Dansby Swanson and will Cody Bellinger be back, and what's happening in the catcher position, all of that. But let's say that there is something there. How much more ultimately will need to be added or spent for this guy to get to where he thinks he can be to have a core of a winner?
Yeah, you've hit it right on the head. I think really this is a team that keeps trying to be a sort of a regional power rather than swinging
Mm-hmm.
with the Yankees and the Mets and the Dodgers, even the Phillies as the biggest spending teams in baseball. They're not necessarily trying to mimic that model. I think they need to start. The rules are stacked in such a way, the CBA is written to make those big market teams spend, which means going past the first level and probably even the second level of the luxury tax when you're heading into a competitive window. When you already have some money on the books that isn't great, that you kind of need to make up for, I think you need to get more aggressive. I think they should be out there looking to add one or two big pieces that way in free agency. I also think it doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive addition. It could be expensive, but in a different way. They have this farm system that is stacked with depth, but the same thing missing from this big league roster, which is kind of what you hope would be your best or second best player. Like that's the missing man in this formation is the star. That's the same thing sort of missing from this farm system. There's all kinds of good players. There's really good sort of top end depth, except there isn't a superstar. There isn't a guy like Jackson Churio of the Brewers. There isn't a guy like Jackson Holliday. I don't even know if they have anyone named Jackson who's any good. I think they might want to move some of these good but not star caliber farm system pieces for guys who are controllable and still relatively cheap on other teams, but who fit their needs right now. And so spend prospect capital instead of spending huge money this winter. That might be the approach. I think they understand they need to make a big addition. They just might be conceiving of it a little differently than we do.
You get two frontline players to go after, and I'll ask you position wise. You get two frontline players at whichever position that you would want. And this is by way of either spending the money or by moving these young pieces that Jed Hoyer has in the farm system. What positions do you add at specifically?
I would not be averse to adding to the pitching staff from outside the organization. Not because I have particular searing doubts about guys like Jordan Wicks or Cade Horton, but because you don't really want to count on those guys going into next year. And you are going to have Kyle Hendricks going out. Obviously, he hasn't been front of the rotation caliber anyway. And you just like to really stick someone right near the front of the rotation. Someone like Corbin Burns, Max Fried, Jack Flaherty. It's going to be a pretty good crop of free agent starters this winter. That's one place I'd be looking. The other place is the other end of the battery. I think that's the clearest position at which they don't have a contract locked in. They have an obvious room to grow, to upgrade. You can believe if you choose to in Miguel Amaya's development or in Moises Ballesteros, who's in Iowa right now. I would be looking, and I know that they have been looking too, at some of the ways that it would take a splash. It would take a big expenditure of one type or another, but I'd be out there looking for a catcher this winter.
Let's talk about Dansby Swanson a little bit. I just looked. So he's the sixth highest paid shortstop in Major League Baseball currently. Hard to believe Javier Baez is seventh, by the way, from a middle infield standpoint. So that may, for those who feel terrible about Dansby Swanson, that may make you feel just a little bit better. How do you think that contract will age overall? I think some people think that, there was a spike in his numbers with the Braves, and that's not the guy that the Cubs are ever going to get, and they're going to regret that deal. I don't necessarily feel that way about Dansby. I think his defense is top shelf. I know he got off to struggles, but guys slump in the field just like they do at the plate. And I think offensively, he's still working through some things, and we've seen it get better. How do you expect that contract to age for Dansby Swanson?
It's tough because, actuarially, it starts to work against you. He turned 30 this winter. And when you're a guy like Dansby, who is not, he's a great defender, it hasn't been great defense because he's the fastest or strongest armed guy in the world. That can be a good thing. That means the fundamental floor is really strong. That means, he makes the routine play routinely as well as anyone in baseball. And just because you've done all that hard work and you've put yourself in these great positions, the baseball gods don't exempt you from aging, from losing half a step. And maybe you don't have that half a step to lose because you were already a little slower than other guys at that position. So I worry a little bit about it that way. But as you said, ever since a rocky start, he's looked really good again this year in the field. At the plate, I just wrote about this today at Northside Baseball. It looks like he made some adjustments over the All-Star break that I'm interested to see how well he can sustain him, but getting his hands a little more under control, not letting him out as early, being able to control the barrel through the hitting zone a little bit better. I think that's something he let go of because he was trying to make up for that knee injury. We know he's kind of been nursing all year. I think he was trying to sort of artificially generate more power. All it was doing was costing him quality of contact and control of the strike zone, which normally he's pretty good at. So let's give it some time to see how those things set and how long he can sustain them over the second half. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I think I feel better about it a month and a half ago now than I did a month and a half ago, which is maybe the opposite of the way I thought it was going to move.
Yeah, and I think our expectations for Dansby may be higher than they should be. And I put that on Jed Hoyer, by the way, because if they did have more of an all-star, middle-of-the-order kind of guy that we would look to drive in more runs, and that would be the guy that we'd be like, well, wait a minute, your production is not okay, because he actually is that kind of player, where Dansby may be getting more blame. Not that he isn't being paid well, we would all love that, but I think he may be facing more blame because of a lack of an offense with power.
Yeah, and because, at least the perception is they actively chose him over guys that we knew would have been more of a two-way threat at shortstop. I mean, I don't know that Trey Turner was ever going anywhere but Philly, but the Cubs didn't even talk to him. They talked a little bit to Carlos Correa, but they locked in on Dansby Swanson very early in that process, in that winter of a whole lot of options being out there. And locking in that way on him, it almost adds another layer of pressure. Not only are you not adding the big bopper to the lineup, and so you're asking more of his bat than maybe is in it, but you also, the fans are not going to be able to forget that you very actively chose him over these other players. Now, maybe the contract age is better than some of those too. There are injury issues with each of those guys. There are some performance questions with Xander Bogaerts. But I think that too, that aspect of you had guys who gave you a little more of what you were specifically missing that were out there at the same position. You chose Dansby because of the defense, because of the leadership, because of intangibles, whatever. And now a year and a half later, you're still casting about for some of the things that those other guys could have given you. While Dansby's leadership, valuable though it might be, hasn't turned into a whole lot of extra wins that we can see on the field. Hasn't put them into the playoffs, for instance, either of his first two seasons in Chicago.
You think the Cubs have a chance to make a run at the wild card this year? Again, at last check, 4 games under 500. I think there were 8 teams in front of them, including the 2 that would be in right now if the season were to end tomorrow. Is that a complete pipe dream, or is it because of the new way that the playoffs break down, the amount of teams that are allowed in? You think the Cubs have a chance to make a run at this?
I've been trying to slowly reassess it because I think I maybe gave myself an analytical cop-out 5 or 6 weeks ago and went, I'm looking at this team, and I don't think they can win anything I really consider worth winning. I think, if things really broke well, they could crawl their way to 86 or 87 wins, probably look bad in the playoffs and go home. That's not my idea of what you build a baseball team to be. I'd like to see them start building toward the idea of winning 92, 93, 94 games every year for a decade. That's what I look for in an enjoyable baseball team. But the way this season has unfolded over those last few weeks, it is more encouraging. It is, there are some really interesting things happening. PCA's development is coming along much better than it looked like it was throughout June when it got very ugly. They've patched some of those holes. They're getting a little healthier. I wouldn't completely rule it out. They made their choice at the deadline not to play for that, to just let it be what it is. But Craig Counsell's a pretty good manager, and I think we're starting to see some of that bear fruit in a way that it didn't over the first few months. He really did. Maybe he kept those guys steadier than it seemed, maybe even though for a while we all lamented that they didn't seem disengaged, but they also didn't show the sense of urgency that I think a lot of fans were looking for. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing because they seem to have more left in the tank than you would have thought a team who got beat down so much over the first 3 months would have at this stage of the season. It can't completely say no, but I wouldn't bet on it. And again, I think the ceiling is still pretty low for this team, but they're at least making it more interesting and more fun to watch than you could have easily been afraid they would by this point, looking back a month or two.
So is that how we should somewhat judge Craig Counsell the rest of the way, is keeping an eye on, using the term how hard they play? Baseball is a very interesting game simply because it is a little more business-like because you do it literally every day for 6 months. So you can't have those highs and lows, but at the same time, you'd like to see more fire. You'd like to see more anger as someone watching it. It's more enjoyable when they're pissed when they're losing than just losing. And we didn't necessarily get that from the Cubs in the first half. And I do feel like recently I've seen them walk with their chests out a little bit more. Winning will help do that, but in baseball at times, if you're losing, you got to find other ways to go about it, like a manager getting ejected when an umpire makes an atrocious call, which we've seen Counsell pass on a couple of times. So how can we scout? How can we keep an eye on Counsell for him to look to be the guy that Jed Hoyer paid for the rest of the way here?
Really, what I'm watching is how do the young players come along under his stewardship? This is a pretty veteran laden team, and you hope that Ian Happ, Dansby Swanson, Jamison Tyone, even Justin Steele, who hasn't experienced a playoff run before or anything, but these guys have been in the big leagues long enough. They've carried themselves around a big league clubhouse long enough that you figure they're going to bring their own, energy to the park.
Right.
The youngsters can get down on themselves more easily. They can get disengaged when the stakes sort of fall out from under them a little more easily. And Counsell did such a great job, not only of managing the emotions and the grind of the season for young players while he was in Milwaukee, but also in just materially improving those players as seasons went along. Young guys would come up, they would go through periods of struggle, but by the end of the year, they would be contributing key innings, coming up with key hits in huge moments. And if the Cubs have anything like, they used to call it Craig Timber in Milwaukee when the calendar flipped to September. If the Cubs have anything like that left in them this year, it's going to have to be powered by PCA, by further improvement from Miguel Amaya, who's looked really good since he made that swing change, and by this young and sort of tossed up in the air pitching staff. I don't need to see the Cubs get into the playoffs from here, but I do want to see Counsell show that he still has all those tools in the belt, that he can still, at the age of 52 now, connect with these young players in a way that does allow him to bring them along and develop people at the big league level, because that's a huge thing we weren't seeing David Ross do. Huge reason, I think, why they actively chose Counsell over Ross. So this is the time for him to shine.
Man, I always enjoy your work. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Justin.